This is the Texas Land Guys podcast, hosted by brothers Tim Dosch and Tom Dosch. With their partners David Marshall and Trip Rich, they have built DMRE, the leading land brokerage in Texas. With decades of experience brokering deals between landowners and real estate developers, they take you inside the deals that move the market.
All right. Well, welcome to the podcast. We have an exciting episode today. We've got David Marshall joining Tim and I. We thought one of the earlier episodes it'd be fun to talk about DMRE's history. And so, David, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I think Tim and I have done a few episodes, and we wanted to give our audience a little bit more background on where we came from, what led to the starting of DMRE, and we hope we can share lessons learned just through years of being in the business, starting a company, and working together in teams. I'll start by saying a lot of today's episode will predate me because I didn't join as a partner until later on. But I'm so thankful for both Tim and David who are on this call. They've been great partners to me. We've had a lot of fun together. We've gone through a lot of challenges together. And hopefully today you'll get to hear just a little bit of what I get to experience every day working with them, just guys with great hearts that are great leaders and have accomplished a lot. So I'm gonna be kind of interviewing them today, which I've been looking forward to, and I hope that we can all gain some wisdom from both of these guys. So
Thanks,
Tim,
Tom.
let's start with you, Tim. So you, I think I said this on another podcast. You were kind of the genesis of the team that we've created into a company over time. So tell me about how you initially got into land brokerage.
So I started a land brokerage back in '04, and I'd actually looked pretty extensively into the industry and met with a lot of people. And I was fresh out of college, and I remember people would ask, like, "What do you want to do? What part of real estate do you want to be in?" And it was always like, "How am I supposed to know? Do I want to do retail or industrial or office or land?" But as I got into it and started talking to more people, what I loved about land was just the creativity of looking at a site. Every site's different. Every seller's different. There's all kinds of development and use types, and it was very interesting to me. And the other specialties were interesting too, but it was a lot of the same thing over and over again. So I was very fortunate just to get started in the business. It was hard to get in. And there's a neat story even about how that happened. But I got into the business. I spent a couple of years working and learning. Did a lot of transactions. I think the best way to learn is just to go do deals, and that's what I did. And then had an amazing opportunity on a plane going to India, actually, on a mission trip. I happened to sit next to a guy named David Wiley, who was at Apartment Realty Advisors, and they had met that morning and talked about hiring a land broker to lead an effort to go find sites for their development clients. And a guy that all of us know very well, who's a legend in the business, Martin Fine, a great developer. He had told the partners at ARA, if you really want to get our business and if you want to help us, hire a land broker who can help us find sites. And so that was kind of why they were looking for a land broker. And I was interested in kind of making a move in the business and finding a new spot. And it was just a perfect meeting. Really a God thing. On a plane to India, I had no expectation of that conversation happening. And we just started talking. We talked for hours sitting next to each other. And he basically offered me the job on the plane going to India. And that's kind of how it started, how I got to ARA.
Yeah, that's a great story. I've always been amazed that was kind of the genesis, and that was 2007. And so,
That's right. Yeah.
David, in 2007, you were also working at ARA, but your background was a little bit different. You didn't start in land brokerage, and then you didn't necessarily go to ARA for land brokerage. So do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I got started in the consulting world. The company I worked for was a small startup that broke off from one of the one of the big five, or at the time it was big four accounting firms. And so I did consulting work for 2.5 years. And then I wanted to get into something else. I was doing real estate financial valuation work along with tax depreciation work. And so I ended up getting hired over at Apartment Realty Advisors in 2005, where I was on the apartment side. I started off as an analyst and I'd worked my way up to an associate level, and my plan was to to do investment sales on the apartment side. And then when Tim came over in 2007 to start the land team for Apartment Realty Advisors, we happened to do a land deal together where we represented a buyer who purchased a site in the energy corridor. And, Tim and I had never met before until he came over to ARA, but unbeknownst to us, and we figured this out, several months after meeting, our wives were sorority sisters at Baylor University. So they had known each other for, quite a while, but shows you how small of a world it is. But, Tim approached me shortly after we did that first deal and asked if I wanted to, join him on the land side. And, you know, uh, my plan, when I went over to Apartment Realty Advisors was to stick with apartments and do investment sales brokerage, and land was the last thing on my mind. I thought about it, prayed about it, and, ultimately, went to Tim and said, yeah, I'd love to partner up. And, looking back, it was probably one of the best decisions from a business standpoint that I've ever made. Couldn't ask for a better partner in Tim. And, it's been a great run. We started off in 2008. January 1st, 2008 was when I officially made the move over to the land side of the business. And, we'll get into kind of the first couple years of what that was like, but it was definitely an interesting time to be in the land brokerage business right before the Great Recession.
Yeah, it was perfect timing to get started as a land
That's
broker.
right.
It might be good to back up real quick and just say what ARA was, or Apartment Realty Advisors, because the company doesn't exist anymore. But at the time, it was probably the top apartment investment sales company in the country, or at least one of the probably big three or big four. It was 26 offices, and they're locally owned. It was kind of a network of brokers who banded together to compete against these big global firms like CB and JLL and Cushman, those kind of firms. And it was, I think, being at ARA was very formative for all of us for a lot of reasons. One of them was they worked as a team, and that was something that was different from at least from the land brokerage, other brokerage companies. And we decided to work as a team, and we ended up building the team over time, and that's kind of the roots of why we work as a team here at DMRE. But also being apartment investment sales brokers, they knew the apartment business inside out, and we ended up learning the land part of that, working with developers inside and out, all the different developers, the different development types. Just got a ton of experience on that side, understanding rents and cap rates, and what made a deal successful, what made a deal not successful. A lot of great introductions were made there, and I think also just an entrepreneurial spirit. The guys who led ARA, David Alfke, Matt Rotan, David Wiley, David Mitchell, were entrepreneurs. They had been at CB. They had left and started their own deal and had been successful in a very difficult business to be successful and to compete at. And so there are just a lot of ways that I think they encouraged us. It was a very positive environment. I think a lot of the ways that we try and lead now, we learned a lot of those values and those skills, just watching them and being at ARA. So we're very grateful for that. The reason it doesn't exist anymore is they sold the company, and we'll get to that later. But they sold the company in 2014.
Yeah, that's great, Tim. That's good background. And thanks, David. When you were talking about your wives meeting each other as sorority sisters, it reminded me that pretty much everyone I've ever met somehow was your fraternity brother at Baylor, or
That's right.
one removed. That's the joke around the office, is that everybody knows David, and David's probably the nicest person you're ever going to meet. So we,
One degree of separation from David Marshall.
that's
And
right.
what also would be
You're right.
interesting to add here is, so Tom and I grew up in an oil family. Our dad worked for Conoco. We moved around a lot. I lived in Alaska, California. Tom was born actually in Midland. We lived in Texas, a couple different places. Montana, for a
Yeah.
lot of kind of my formative years. Oklahoma, Tom lived in Oklahoma for a while. So we moved around a lot. We kind of had roots in Texas, but not as much as David. So David was, born and raised in Memorial here in Houston, and has a great network and a lot of friendships that go way back, go back decades with his family. So that's been a huge value to the partnership and to our company.
Yeah, something we can get into here in a little bit is partnership itself, and the value of having partners and everyone bringing something a little bit different to the table. But I'm sure even when you guys started and it was just the two of you, Tim, that was kind of a calculus you were making, when you said, David, why don't you come over? Let's partner up. And I don't know if there's any more to say about that right now, but I know, David, you already were dipping your toe into land deals. Like you said, you guys worked on that deal together, and the market was pretty good because that it obviously was leading up to the crisis. But what was the market like in '06 and in '07 on the land side?
Yeah, it was very frothy. And, thinking from a partnership standpoint, I think I realized going over to ARA and being by myself, because I was the only person that was hired to be a land broker. I realized that to really, make an impact and grow the business, I needed a partner. And so I didn't start that right away, but, David mentioned that deal that we did together, pretty quickly we started working together. And, really within probably 9 months or so, we partnered up. So, I mean, it happened pretty quickly. And I think I just realized, I needed the help. I needed to work with someone, and we'd be a lot more effective together, even though it would, we'd be splitting the pie up, and I wouldn't get all for myself. But, being diluted, but bringing in someone who was really strong ended up, creating a lot bigger opportunity for both of us. But yeah, it was a very frothy market. I remember actually one of my first times I spoke in public in a real estate event. I did a debate with Bill McDade. At the time, he was just a legend in the business, an old land broker. He had a large land brokerage company that kind of controlled Houston from a land brokerage standpoint. They had hundreds of listings, and he was a really good guy. And so, anyway, we did this debate, and we were talking about how frothy the market was, and little did we know the market was about to crash, and it was probably the most significant crash anyone had seen since the '80s. And we had always heard, being young in the business, the old guys would tell us, like, you don't really know anything about real estate because you weren't around the '80s. And until you go through that, you don't really understand what it was like. And so we got to experience the Great Recession, and David got to experience it basically his first year in the business, which was an amazingly difficult time. I would say kind of a scarring time for us, but I think in a healthy way, it really helped us understand the business and deals, and we learned a lot of lessons that I think have been incredibly valuable for us and protected us a lot ever since then. So it'd be great to kind of talk about that and some of those experiences.
Yeah, and I can kind of add a little to that. Tim's right. My first exposure or real exposure to the land brokerage business started in January 1st, 2008. I know I mentioned Tim and we did a land deal prior to that, but it was kind of on the tail end of that frothy market he was talking about. And, when Tim and I partnered up in January 1, 2008, the first 6, 7 months of the year were great. We were putting deals under contract, business was good. Things hadn't closed yet just because land deals typically take time. And a lot of the deals we were doing at the time were development deals. So those tend to take longer than normal. But, first 6, 7 months were good. And then October hit. And it might have been slightly before October when the Great Recession really started to set in. And the last 4 months of the 2008, we'd come into work every day and a new deal would fall out of contract. So it was definitely an interesting time to get into the business, a tough time to get into the business. But I tell young guys who are getting into the business now, going through that kind of market, it's a great thing to experience, especially as a young broker. And you learn so much through a market like that. Every deal is a dogfight, and you just got to grind, and you've got to know the ins and outs of every deal that you work on. And it was you know looking back, it was probably the best thing to happen to me, being a young broker, getting into the land brokerage business, experiencing a market like that. And so that kind of was 2008. And then the recession hit, and we kind of went into 2009. And, for those of you who didn't experience the Great Recession, it was basically the tail end of '08 all the way through 2010. And it really started to come out of it in 2011 in Houston and kind of Texas, mostly Houston. They came out of the Great Recession a little earlier than the rest of the country because we had the oil and gas business that really started to ramp up and do well in early 2011. So that allowed us to kind of, get out of that Great Recession quicker than most of the country. But, the heart of the Great Recession was 2009 and 10. And, like I mentioned, every deal was a dogfight. I think in 2008, kind of the tail end of 2008, in that year alone, I think Tim and I maybe closed one deal together. And it was slim pickings. And I think that year alone, Tim and I might have made $25,000. So it was definitely a tighten your belt buckle and kind of year for sure. But it was, like I mentioned early on, it was a great thing to experience as a young broker getting into the land brokerage business.
Yeah, we had one deal that closed, but we had, I think we had about 20 deals fall to contract. So I remember we had around a $2.5 million, fee pipeline, which, as being young guys in our 20s, we were pretty excited about that to close all those deals, make all that money. And then, and we worked hard for those deals to get those deals under contract, all over the city. And then just one by one, they started falling out. And it's pretty. I think one of the biggest things that you learn going through a market like that is resilience. Just being willing to grind. And when you get super depressing news, and sometimes it just feel like someone just physically beat you up at the end of the day because of how brutal it was, but getting up the next day and going to work in and just staying in it. It was interesting as a lot of the young guys our age who were in the land brokerage business got out. I think almost everybody did. And David and I were one of the only two guys our age that stayed in through that time, and staying in the business through that time set us up to be so successful afterwards. But it was hard to stay in because of how brutal it was, and it wasn't like there was a lot of hope. I mean, when you're in that time, it was like, is this going to be a depression? Is this going to last 10 years? People close to you are saying stuff like, "Hey, is this the right career move for you? Should you be doing something else?" I mean, it was a pretty bleak outlook, but staying with it and having a good partner that helped me stay with it and be encouraged. Our wives support us in it. It was I'm really thankful that we did stay with it.
Yeah, a question I remember we would get quite a bit in the recession was, "Are y'all still in the business?"
Yeah, that's
Just
right.
because so many brokers were getting out of the business, especially land brokers. And Tim hit on a great point. It taught us a ton of resiliency. One, and to go through that by yourself, is really, really, really difficult. But thank goodness, I had Tim as a partner, so you had somebody to go through that with, which made it, it was still hard, but made it so much easier having a partner to go through that difficult time with you.
I remember one time we were at a restaurant and it was like during kind of the most difficult time in the recession. Nothing was going right, and we were at this little, it was like a little burger place. It was a little cheap place, and we were eating lunch. And there was this waitress who was working really hard, and you could just tell it wasn't like a fancy place, so she was probably scraping by and not making a lot of money, but she was really working hard. I remember telling David, "Man, I feel sorry for her. She's working so hard. She doesn't probably make very much money." And David said, "Well, she's making more money than we are," because we were pretty much in the negative at that point.
I remember that.
Uh,
That was at Christian's Tailgate over there
yeah,
off I-10 in Washington.
yeah, it was.
So
I mean, that's just how bad it was. It was like it was rough. So.
So the question that's coming to my mind, you guys kind of hit on it, but how did you stick with it? Because to be in the middle of something like that and not know when it's ending, and really you almost couldn't even pay the bills because you're both married, you both have families. What was it that you feel like actually really got you through it, and you had that, endurance and commitment to stick with it?
yeah, if you don't mind,
Go
I'll
go ahead,
start
yeah.
take this one and then you can add on. So in January of '08, I'd recently gotten, or I got married in '03, or sorry, in 2005. Donna and I, my wife, Donna, we had our first kid in August of '08. So we had a newborn also. Uh, and to answer your question, a huge help for me, during that time period, and I think the same for Tim, was our wives were still working. So, they had income coming in from their jobs, which was obviously a huge help, which helped allow us to, stick with it and stay in the business, because we had a paycheck coming in, not necessarily from us, but from our wives. So that was a huge benefit and allowed us to really, like I mentioned, stick with it. And it was also one of those things. I think we both made up our minds. Hey, we're doing this. You know, and I don't care what it takes. We're going to roll up our sleeves. We're going to tighten our belt buckles. and we're going to make it happen. Failure wasn't really an option in
Mhm.
my mind or Tim's mind. We had made a decision to be partners, and we wanted to do land brokerage, and we were gonna figure it out one way or the other, and so that's what we did. And like I mentioned, thank goodness we had wives who were still employed and working, which was a huge help and benefit. But like I mentioned, failure wasn't an option, and this is what we wanted to do. We wanted to be partners, and wanted to be partners in the land brokerage business.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was gonna say. I mean, failure wasn't an option. I didn't, I guess at the time, I just didn't see anything else I wanted to do, and I think when you have that perspective of we have to make this work, no matter what, we have to make it work. And no matter how bad it gets, I just had this belief that we have to keep going and it's gonna eventually get better. And I think some of that too is probably the encouragement of the partners at ARA. They were just great leaders, and they never pressured us, never said, "Hey, when are you guys going to do some deals?" They were encouraging when deals would keep falling out, and they knew we were working hard and doing our best. And so I think that was also something that maybe helped out, and just saying we're going to stay with this. And then I think, God provided for us, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But, even though it was tough, we didn't make a lot of money. We actually did make money through the recession, and we did close deals, which was pretty unusual at the time. And we were able to, especially I think '08 was probably our worst year, but then '09, it was tough, but we still closed some deals. And then 2010, when I think a lot of people got washed out because they couldn't make it, we ended up doing a lot of REO deals, and we were very blessed to get in. I remember we had several banks we worked for at the time, but I remember the first deal that we pitched for one of the major relationships we had. There was a site up on 249. I remember it was lots and some land, and every broker in town wanted that listing. And I remember we were actually talking to Davis Adams at the time, and I think we were both looking at it or something, and he was pitching it too. And maybe there were a couple other brokers to talk to, but the idea was kind of like, well, you guys aren't going to get this listing. I mean, you guys are two young guys at this apartment investment sales deal, and we probably shouldn't have got it. There were guys who are better qualified than us who were going after it. But we went and pitched that business, and we got that business, and it was a great transaction. And then that led to many more transactions with that bank. We were probably their major broker that did most of their deals. First on the REO side, and eventually on the note side, we sold hundreds of notes for them, and then sold, I don't know, probably like it was like 30 or 40 REO deals. It was a lot of deals. But it just, I mean, I look back on my career. There's so many like pivotal points, like being on the airplane and meeting David Wiley, or just these times where it's like, this isn't a coincidence. I mean, God had his hand on, even on bringing David and I together as partners, Tom, on you coming over and being our partner. These like really unique, things that happened that changed the course of, my career, and really helped it a lot. So I think getting in on the REO side was huge, because being in our 20s to get that business, most of the people that got that business were much older brokers who'd been around for decades and had their bank relationships, and their buddy was over to bank and they got those deals. We didn't really have that, and so that made it pretty amazing.
When you guys are talking, I'm thinking about our core values at DMRE of humble, hungry, smart. And that's something that when we started DMRE, we came up with those values, and we'll talk in this next episode more about that. But when David was talking about just failure is not an option and how hard you guys were working, really when there wasn't a lot of hope, that's the hunger piece of what we talk about as a core value. You really can't be a good broker without being hungry. There's no easy deals. I think a lot of people think that you can just kind of do a couple deals a year and work part-time, and brokers make way too much money, but we spend so much time working on deals that don't happen, for clients, and just things that never come to fruition. We build pipelines, and then the market changes and those pipelines disintegrate. So the hunger definitely came out, and then the humility. Tim, when you were talking about the partners and just that view you had of, you know, it's a privilege to be here and to be at ARA and to be working and have this opportunity and to be given this opportunity. And so your thought of, the partners aren't actually coming to us and saying you guys aren't closing enough deals, versus I think a lot of people, they have the opposite attitude of kind of going to the partners in that scenario and saying, hey, you need to pay me to keep me, even though I'm not closing any deals or bringing anything in. And so that's real humility that was coming through with that. And so I think it's neat to think about all that these lessons you guys learned during that time, and those have become foundations of our company now. Just when you see unfortunately the culture we're in now with a lot of the just young people that we talk to and interview, it's just a lot of entitled individuals, and I think something like the GFC probably beats entitlement out of you. And so having that at the beginning was really formative.
No, I think just dealing with kind of cold hard reality. I mean, when everybody's losing their job and people are losing their homes, getting foreclosed on, it was a difficult time. And, I think once you got the listings that we got, the hard part was selling them because there weren't a lot of buyers in the market. The developers are out of the market. Every deal was a cash deal. No banks would lend on land. Nobody wanted land. So a lot of these sites were worth, 20 or 30% of what they had been worth just because there were no buyers. And so that was our challenge. And we got these notes that were all over Texas, and some of them are out of state. A lot of the REO deals are down the valley, down McAllen, Brownsville areas. So we had to go down there and find buyers and, deal with all kinds of different people down there. And, you just learn a lot going through uh, those kind of situations. How do you go make it happen for your client when everything's kind of stacked against you, and against your client? And, when you have these sites that are difficult sites, a lot of the deals that got foreclosed on had problems, besides the Great Recession and the lack of capital, there were problems with the sites. There was no utilities, or there were weird sites and weird locations, weird submarkets, a lot of these tertiary markets, that there weren't a lot of buyers anyway. And so just trying to figure out, like, how do we go maximize the price for them? The bank wanted to move things quickly, but keep a higher, the highest price they could. And so how do you go find a real cash buyer, find them quickly and not sacrifice too much on price? And so I think that helped us too, because I think a big part of our story coming out of that was, becoming listing brokers and representing a lot of clients in Houston on difficult sites and maximizing the price for them. And so having to cut our teeth in these tough markets, where you're dealing with all kinds of different buyers and trying to figure out who's real and, and all that, we had to learn that kind of the hard way in a very difficult environment to do it.
What were
Yeah, I
REO
mean
deals like? Were they, just from a term standpoint in that time? Like, what did the average deal look like? Earnest money and closing time periods, and were these deals selling at 30% of value? Or I'm sure that there's no simple answer to that, but
Yeah, so I mean, it was a first off the assets we were selling, they were all land and notes, but the notes were on land, and it was a mixed bag. I mean, there was the good, the bad, and the ugly.
It was a lot of the ugly.
A lot of the ugly. So there were for every good asset, there were probably 10 ugly ones and bad ones. But it was just a bunch of random stuff. I mean, hundreds, if not thousands of acres down in Los Fresnos and in the valley. Lots in New Mexico. There was stuff in Houston in the major markets here in Texas as well. But immediately, these notes or these REO assets immediately, because it was an all cash business, banks were not lending on anything, much less land. So immediately, roughly probably 50% of the value was washed away because there was there weren't land loans, there was no debt out there. So that was kind of the baseline, and then it reduced from there based on location, quality of the asset, and things like that. But at a minimum, we were seeing, or at the most, these properties were selling for 50 cents on the dollar, and in most cases, it was 25, 30 cents on the dollar.
Mm.
Most of the times, the terms were quick closes. The banks weren't in the business of going under contract for an extended period of time. They wanted to see contract to close very quickly for a land deal. So anywhere from a couple weeks to maybe a couple months.
wow.
Yeah, I was going to say that the good deal sold for 50% of value. And you have to remember that the values were inflated because of how hot things have been. We were way oversupplied with lots, which is, the market's still recovering from the overcorrection that happened with the banks that time. The banks stopped lending on all these lot deals because it got hurt so bad by lots in the Great Recession. But there was just all these deals, and a good deal was sold for 50% of prior value. And then, like David said, the bad deals were it was, 70 to 80% discount on some of those deals, and maybe it was only like a 30 or 40% real discount off probably what it was really worth. But the banks had these super high valuations on these sites because of how hot and how crazy the market was going into the recession.
Yeah, so those buyers that were buying at those discounts, I know I've heard both of you say in the past, those ended up being, in a lot of cases, some pretty amazing opportunities, where people bought and then ended up selling. Because talk about when the market started to come back. So I think, David, you already mentioned it really ran all the way through 2010, but then with oil and gas in Houston was one of the first major markets to come out of the recession. So when do you remember when you started to feel like, okay, things are starting to improve, and what some of those indicators were? And then how quickly did it go from a little bit of hope to now we're really busy and it's really coming back? Or was that a slow adjustment?
You know, like I mentioned earlier, Houston, we were fortunate because we had the oil and gas industry that really, was doing well and started to do well, coming out of 2010. And so we were probably a good 9 to 12 months ahead of the rest of the country in terms of coming out of the Great Recession. And, I remember the first deal we did coming out of the Great Recession. It's actually a deal that we had put under contract prior to the Great Recession. And it was with one of the top, apartment developers in the city, very reputable, credible group who, had no problems at all getting stuff capitalized. But, leading into the Great Recession, they ended up dropping the contract. Well, they put it under contract shortly after, or shortly into 2011, and it might have even been early 2010, and they were able to get it capitalized, but that was kind of the start of it. It wasn't necessarily it came, it didn't ramp up really quickly. I'd say it was more of a kind of a slow progression into late 2010, early 2011, but that was the first sign that things were starting to come back. And I mean, that first deal, it still wasn't an easy deal for them to get capitalized. It was a dogfight, and they had to talk to a bunch of different equity providers and lenders, but they were able to get it done. So that was the first experience, or first kind of thing that I noticed coming out of the Great Recession.
Yeah, I'd say the first like real boom cycle that I got to take advantage of was probably 2012 to 2014. Because I think 2011 things were recovering, but I mean the Great Recession was so close to everybody's memory. Everybody was pretty scarred from that, and so a lot of the developers and everyone was being a little bit cautious, and so there were deals happening, and it was a way different market than 2010 had been. We were able to shift a lot of our focus from REO and note sales to going and getting great listings, to going and representing buyers, and really getting into the business that we do now. And we had a early listing that we got over off Post Oak Lane here in Houston. It was probably one of our first, big, kind of infill listings. And I think if you look at the next 10 years, we really made a mark as a company, getting these high profile infill listings, creating kind of a bidding war with great credible buyers, and really maximizing the price. And I'm trying to remember what that sold for now because it's been so long, but it sold for just a massive number at the time, way above what anybody thought. It was probably 20 or 30% more than anyone thought. I remember people being mad at us because it sold for so much. Like this should be worth half that. And it's like, well, we sold it for twice what you think it's worth. So I guess that's what it's worth. But with that those kind of things started happening in 2011, and you get into 2012, which you started in 2012, right, Tom?
I did, yeah, summer of 2012.
So David and I, I had made the decision to bring David on and be partners, and we decided, which I think was a really hard decision for us, to start to grow the team even more, because it's like it's one thing working with two people, you start getting more people, and just how do we manage people? And so we were able to kind of pull him over from that. He'd really took a risk, and I think a huge pay cut to come over and start with us. And then Tom really started in that incredible time, 2012 through 2014, where we just saw, a ton of transactions. I think our business completely changed. I remember sometime around that time, people went from, asking, are you still in the business, to people saying like, who are these? Where do these guys come from? Because it's like these two guys in their 20s, they're growing a team. A lot of the older brokers had kind of gotten out of the business, or were, like the whole McDade company had fallen apart, and those brokers kind of scattered. And so it was just it was a little bit of an, the market opportunity was up for grabs, and there were young brokers who were coming in, kind of taking advantage of that. And we got to be a part of that. And so that was a really formative time for us to kind of grow our first little team, at ARA. And I think it was cool. The partners there let us kind of grow a little business underneath ARA and have our own team and really run it and operate it, almost like its own little company, even though we were still part of the bigger company.
Yeah, that was a big thing. The partners at ARA, Apartment Realty Advisors, David Alfke, Matt Rotan, David Wiley, and David Mitchell gave us that launching pad to start a business within a business, and they were there to help any way we could. Like Tim mentioned earlier, they had an entrepreneurial spirit. They had kind of broken off from a global brokerage firm earlier in their careers, so we can't thank them enough for giving us that launching pad to start the land division at ARA, and then just kind of giving us free will to kind of go make it happen. And they were there to help us out when we needed it. So they were huge mentors of ours and very appreciative of kind of that opportunity they gave us.
And Tim, your point about where do these guys come from? There's a couple deals that I was thinking about. So David mentioned the really large deal that you did with Martin Fine, and that was, correct me if I'm wrong, that was about 11 acres inside the loop. That was an enormous site, several phases to go from doing REO deals to closing a development like that. Then in today that would be, you'd be upwards of, $750 million to develop something like that today.
Yeah.
Really what they put there. To
So
also,
David was
go
referring
ahead.
to dealing Katie with Martin Fine. It was one of the first ones that came back with, but you're right. I forgot about the one you're talking about. This was a site that sold probably maybe 6 months later, a little bit later. There was 11-acre site, and it sold for a massive number. I mean, you know, it was easily twice what anyone would have probably thought it was worth, especially coming out of the Great Recession. I remember we had so many kind of lowball offers. And I think it's a credit to Martin Fine, the way he went in and developed that site into three different deals. He designed like a common, green space area with a fountain that he modeled after something he saw in France, on one of his trips. And he was just an incredible, developer, but also had kind of understood the architecture and kind of the artist side of development. And anyway, it was a really, really neat deal. And then catty corner to that, we did a high rise deal around the same time. And that was another one that, coming out of the recession, people just had such a low opinion of land values, and could you get these kind of deals done? And I remember we were trying to get I think around $100 a foot for that, and everybody was like, "There's no way any land is ever going to trade over $100 a foot. That's crazy." And that deal sold for somewhere in that price range, and it was a 40-story high rise. So that was a buy rep deal, or was that a listing?
Buy a rep deal, yeah.
Buy rep, so that was one of our first big kind of buy rep infill deals that we did,
And the
and just
third
a
was
high profile deal.
the deal you mentioned, Tim, the listing off North Post Oak. But just those three, to close three, kind of, you could say the North Post Oak deal is kind of like an interloop deal. So, just three really core sites. And to think, fast forward, we've closed something like 360 multifamily deals now, land deals together, which is incredible. And there's corners in Houston, like that area of West Alabama, where I remember doing experience maps early on, and it was like we had sold like every corner, and it's all been redeveloped. And so I think that's always been what makes this business fun, is driving around and getting to see like our fingerprint on the city where we put developers on sites, and now get to see the city get built.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's pretty amazing to see just how the developments have progressed throughout the years, and each kind of boom cycle, getting to be a part of all these deals and just seeing the new innovations that developers bring in, and the way that different developers think about these sites. Like for Martin Fine to go develop that big of a site into three different deals is just outside the box for pretty much any developer. I mean, no one really looks at deals that way, but he was able to figure out how to create a lot of value, create a really special development, and was very successful with it.
Yeah, and every cycle, it seems the very hot area kind of shifts. During that time period, it was the Greenway Plaza area. There was a ton of deals that we were doing over in that area. Old stuff was getting torn down, new stuff was getting built, and it's funny to see how it moves throughout the city, from the Galleria to Greenway to the Heights to the Washington Corridor to Midtown. But you really get to learn each one of these areas within the 610 loop.
I think that's good. I think that, we're going to have more time on this next episode to cover that run up that we were talking about, Tim, that you mentioned of 2012 to 2014, what happened in Houston in 2014. I'm sitting here in Dallas. Dallas wasn't really impacted in 2014. It continued, and so did Austin
Mm-hmm.
on a huge run. But I got involved in the company in 2012, and on this next episode, we'll talk about what kind of led to us breaking away ultimately and starting up DMRE. So, guys, that was great. It was fun to get to watch you guys go back and forth and kind of relive the good old days 15 years ago. I'm sure when you think about when you were in that time, it was really hard. When you look back, there's probably part of you that almost wants to go back and just, be back in the office together, working in that same way, not with the same results, but working, I'm sure there's some special memories there if that resonates or makes sense.
No, I think it's true. I think as men, like struggling together towards a common goal is just part of who we are as men. We all kind of desire that, and people always talk about it's really the journey, not the end point, that's valuable, and trying to enjoy getting there. And I think that's a great advice to anyone in their career. You can always be looking for the next job or the next promotion, or when I make this much money or that much money, but just to enjoy where you are, right now, and the opportunities right now. And as difficult as that was, there's so many cool memories, and facing really difficult things together, and then ultimately overcoming those things. And when we were kind of in the heart of the Great Recession, we never could have dreamed that we'd be sitting here right now with everything that we've been able to accomplish, and that God's blessed us with, now at this point. And so just encouragement wherever you are right now, just to keep going, keep working hard, make sure you're with the right people, make sure that you're aligned right. But business is going to be hard. There's going to be tough seasons, and it doesn't mean it's time to quit. It means it's time sometimes to dig deeper and just to have some endurance and to push through it. And if you can stay in, I've told so many people, a lot of times people turn back right when things are about to really open up for them. And we easily could have quit in 2009 or 2010. And we were literally only, maybe 6 months to a year away from really, actually making a good amount of money and being successful. And that easily could have happened. And so I think that maybe some encouragement for someone who's out there who's struggling, just to keep going. And you may be a lot closer to success than you think you are.
Yeah, and another thing to add to that is, it goes by fast. I can't believe it's already been 16 years since Tim and I partnered up, and Tom, since you've partnered up with us as well. So, enjoy it, because it goes by fast. You're going to look up, and it's going to be 16 years later for you. And there's a lot to be opportunity during downturns, and a lot to be learned during downturns. So, to Tim's point, don't pack it in and move on to the next thing. Roll up your sleeves and work hard, and you will see opportunities that come from downturns, just like you see opportunities when the market's good. So just remember that, and work hard and push on through. But it's like we mentioned earlier, that was probably the best learning experience I ever had, was the Great Recession, and being in this business during that Great Recession. And I wouldn't give that up for the world. So, just remember that.
Mm-hmm.
Great points to end on. All right. Well, thanks to our audience for listening. Looking forward to this next episode where we sit down together again. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to our podcast today. If you have questions about land you own in Texas, send us an email at texaslandguys@dmre.com and follow us on LinkedIn to stay updated.